Now, yeah, we're good to go, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Chunbei, I think you're going to go first. Would you like me to say 2 minutes when it's 2 minutes, or to put it in the chat?
Yeah, please go ahead and say it. I might not be paying attention to the chat. Thank you.
And Chunbei is presenting on immigrant entrepreneurship. When you're ready to go, thank you very much. And thank you for everybody for being here.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
It's all good.
Great. Okay, let me get started then. So this is a chapter on immigrant entrepreneurship, co-authored with Magnus Lofstrom from PPIC. And so Magnus has written quite a few literature review papers on immigrant entrepreneurship. So we thought this paper would be not only building on what he has done before, but also incorporate more of the recent development in the entrepreneurship literature. So to start, immigrants have been documented to be highly entrepreneurial. I think that is a fact that that's been well documented. So basically, the evidence shows that immigrants have higher self-employment rates than natives in many developed countries. Evidence has been found in the United States, in United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Sweden, Denmark. So if you take US as an example, so this is our calculated self-employment rate using the American Community Survey from 2000 to 2019. We can see that if you look at the figure on top there, the blue one is the self-employment rate among immigrants, and then the red is among natives. Immigrants had higher self-employment rate than natives, and the interesting trend that's been going on is that immigrants actually has increased in self-employment rate over time, whereas natives actually have declines in the self-employment rate over time. So the gap between immigrants and natives has increased over time. If you look at the bottom figure there, that's the immigrants' share among the self-employed in the US. And we can see immigrants is representing a larger share among the self-employed in the United States. So if we just look at the self-employment rate, it's hiding a lot of heterogeneity, because we all know that immigrants are a very diverse group. So we wanted to kind of just present some statistics to document some of the recent trends among different major immigrant groups, for example, in the US. So we started with showing the heterogeneity by the countries of origin. If you look at this figure, the comparison here is this turquoise line here. That's the native wise. So we can see that it has a declining trend there. And if you look at the top here, this blue solid line, that's the white immigrants, and they have among the highest self-employment rate, slightly increased over time. And interesting dramatic changes have happened in the US in terms of the self-employment rate. One is among this group, which is the Southwest Asian and Middle Eastern immigrants. They have a dramatic decline in this past couple of decades. And another interesting change in the trend is this substantial increase among the Hispanic immigrants. Their self-employment rate has almost doubled in this past couple of decades. So these are a couple of trends that's been going on in the US, and I think that represents some opportunities for research. I have a couple of papers looking at those trends specifically. Another type of heterogeneity would be looking at the immigrants' education level. And we can see here, we're dividing them into high school dropouts, high school grads, and some college and with college degree or plus. And we can show that it seems like the increase in self-employment rate among immigrants are mostly driven by the less educated. This is the high school dropout, and then this one here is the high school grads. So these two groups have experienced substantial increases in their self-employment rates. Whereas if you look at the more educated with some college or college degree, they are experiencing some kind of decline. Now, the heterogeneity is not just existing in the immigrant subgroups, but in terms of the types of self-employment. So if we use survey data to document self-employment rate and the change in the trends, self-employment is quite broadly defined in the survey data. They just include everyone who report themselves as self-employed. So that will include employer firms, non-employer firms. They will include self-employed businesses, and recently there's a lot of self-employed gig work, and they will identify themselves as self-employed. And there's also, the opportunity type of entrepreneurship and the necessity type of entrepreneurship, where they are self-employed out of poverty, for example, they're being pushed into self-employment. So our paper will be summarizing a lot of the literature in this immigrant entrepreneurship, but also paying special attention to all the heterogeneity, and specifically some recent advances in documenting the types of self-employment or measuring the types of self-employment. So we'll have 5 main sections. The first part is to look at the determinants of immigrant self-employment decisions. They are focusing mainly on trying to explain why is immigrants having higher self-employment rate than natives in a lot of those developed countries. And we'll also look at some literature on the performance of self-employed immigrants and the contributions of immigrant entrepreneurs. And then in the 4th section, we'll talk about some recent progress in the literature in measuring different types of self-employment and some new data sources available. In the 5th section, we'll talk about the potentials for future studies. So start with the determinants of immigrant self-employment. This is a large literature. There are a lot of papers trying to explain the immigrant self-employment rate, why they're higher. And we categorize them into 3 large groups, including microeconomic factors, macroeconomic factors, or institutional and social factors. So in terms of microeconomic factors, we again categorize them into human capital, financial capital, social capital. And then in terms of macro, we look at mainly the business cycle literature with respect to entrepreneurship. And then the institutional and social factors, so these are related to immigration policies or discrimination. So the microeconomic factors, to start with human capital, typically for immigrants, the relevant variables are education and as well as language skills. So the theoretical prediction is ambiguous, and indeed the evidence is mixed. So we'll have some papers that show that higher education levels or better language skills can lead to increase in self-employment rate because they have the skills needed to be successful in self-employment. But then there are others that shows that if you have higher education or better language skills, then you are less likely to be self-employed because you are more likely to be able to find good jobs in the wage sector. So the opportunity cost will be high. And then another variable that's popular in this human capital literature, looking at determinants of immigrant self-employment, is looking at experience. But since data typically do not have previous self-employment experience, literature has been using home country self-employment rate as a proxy for experience. And again, the evidence is mixed. So some show that people coming from countries with high self-employment rate tend to have high self-employment rate in the host country, but then there are others that don't find that evidence. Another main factor is financial capital. This is related to the liquidity constraints literature, showing that there's a positive relationship between wealth and self-employment. And some recent papers have shown that immigrant-owned businesses start with higher levels of startup capital, and those are mainly from their personal or family savings. There are also some literature showing that immigrants do face some lending discrimination. So we're going to summarize that part of the literature as well. So in terms of social capital, we look at the family background literature and then mainly the ethnic enclaves literature, which is another big literature in this field. So family background literature just shows that having a self-employed parent, either there's some evidence showing that if there's a self-employed father, and then some others show that if either father or mother are self-employed, then it will increase the self-employment rate among the immigrants. The ethnic enclaves literature, again, is showing some mixed evidence as well. So there are literatures that shows that ethnic enclave seems to promote self-employment, and then there are others that shows that they have no effect, or they even have negative impact. Even with more recent attempts to address the endogeneity of sorting into ethnic enclaves, for example, using parental choice of neighborhoods, or some settlement policy to disperse refugee immigrants, such as in Sweden or Denmark, even with those attempts, there's still mixed evidence. So they're not conclusive. We're going to move on to the macro factors. So there's a big literature in the entrepreneurship regarding business cycle. There's the recession push theory, where it shows that recessions would push workers into self-employment when unemployment rate is high. So that would make the self-employment exhibit a counter-cyclical pattern. So the self-employment might appear to be high during recessions. And then there's the prosperity pool theory, showing that economic booms provide more profit opportunities and pull workers into self-employment. So in that case, that self-employment will show a pro-cyclical pattern. So self-employment will be higher during economic growth. Now, empirical research, again, on this is quite mixed, but it seems like recession push seems to be more relevant among immigrants. And then we look at institutional social factors, looking at immigration policies and discrimination. So immigration policies could have a pull effect, for example, some big point-based system that attracts immigrant entrepreneurs. And then there could be a push effect, such as tightened immigration policies targeting undocumented immigrants could push Hispanic and Mexican immigrants into self-employment. And then discrimination could come from employer discrimination or customers. They could possibly both. So employer discrimination could push immigrants into self-employment, whereas customer discrimination could reduce immigrant self-employment. So if we, after talking about all those, seems like there's a lot of mixed findings in this literature. There's no consensus in terms of the effect of a lot of those variables. So, we're trying to see if there's any reconciling of this mixed findings. The theme that emerges from this is that there exists heterogeneity in the types of self-employment. For example, a lot of those research compare the push versus pull effect for immigrants. So some are pulled into self-employment because of profit opportunities. Some are pushed into self-employment because they need a way to make a living. So the relevant literature with that would be recent development, differentiating between opportunity entrepreneurship and necessity entrepreneurship. And I'll come back to this a little later, talking about those recent developments and showing more opportunities for future research. In terms of the second section, we're going to look at performance of self-employed immigrants, and the assimilation literature basically shows that there's some mixed evidence. Self-employed immigrants assimilate faster than their wage counterparts. This is found in the U.S. and Canada. And then in some other countries, for example, Australia and Sweden, they don't do as well or even do worse.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And then there's in the US, there's also heterogeneity. For example, Asian immigrants typically perform well, and then Hispanic and Mexican immigrants, they typically perform worse. The contributions of immigrant entrepreneurs, this literature mainly talks about how immigrant-owned firms are actually more innovative. And in terms of job creation, again, we have some mixed findings. So I'm going to talk about some recent progress. Now, the measurement of self-employment has been usually self-reported, self-employment status in the survey data. But we think that distinguishing the push and pull types of self-employment would help better understand the determinants, the performance and contributions, and maybe even reconcile some of those mixed findings. but it has been difficult due to data limitations. But there is some recent developments. For example, Fairley and Folsom has developed a method to differentiate between necessity entrepreneurship versus opportunity entrepreneurship. And basically, you just need some kind of panel structure in your data. And if a person is entering self-employment from unemployment, it is defined as a necessity entrepreneurship. And whereas if you are entering self-employment from wage sector or out of the labor force, then it's considered as opportunity self-employment. So I have a couple of research using that and really adds depth to the analysis, allows to look at different types of self-employment. And there are some recent data available for immigrant entrepreneurship studies. Usually we'll need individual level survey data, but there's limited information on business types and outcomes, or may only capture main job. And in other cases, business level survey data would have detailed information on businesses, but may not have information on business owner characteristics. So recently available U.S. data actually is trying to address some of those limitations. For example, the annual business survey. Is it time?
Yeah, your time's up.
Okay. So yeah, I think this is basically just a couple of data sets available, and we can make use of those methods and data to push this literature forward to learn more about immigrant entrepreneurship.
Thank you so much. Any questions or comments? I see Klaus has his hand up. Klaus?
Yes, if you want me, I can, of course. If there's somebody else who wants to have a question, that's of course fine. I'm not pushing myself, but I have just a conceptual question. When you speak about migration, to what extent does this differ from ethnicity? Yes, I mean, this comes with entrepreneurship. When you think about entrepreneurship, you often have this idea that migrants have more talent for entrepreneurship, but this can be just forced or out of no alternatives or whatever. Is there kind of a natural allocation of types of entrepreneurship? I mean, in what kind of business you are active, correlated with ethnicity? Of course, we know, let's say, many Koreans are in the nail business or provide sushi or whatever. Yes, but this may have different reasons. Not only can be networking, whatever. So, is there something like ethnic capital make you more pro for entrepreneurship?
That's an interesting part of this literature as well. But since we are looking at immigrant entrepreneurship, we haven't really got into that part of the discussion. But of course, for example, the literature on ethnic enclaves or the networking effect, those will fit very nicely to take into consideration that part of the literature.
Yeah. So I'm not pushing you to do this chapter in now move to ethnicity. I'm just curious to see, because you could do both. Yes, you could leave it to another chapter in the handbook. So my feeling is that you would not touch it too much. Is this right?
Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
I think
thanks.
we'll have some of those discussions in the social capital part of the paper. But it would be, I guess, a small part of that. Okay, you would not be upset if there's another chapter in the handbook dealing with that issue. Okay, yeah, that's why we have the meeting here. Okay, thanks. Otherwise, very nicely structured, and I think it looks interesting. Thanks. Thank you.
Matloob?
Yeah, just a quick one. I mean, I think that the title was entrepreneurship, wasn't it? But you talked mostly about self-employment in a way, which is, it could be a very different thing, if you see what I mean. So because, as you mentioned, I think on your second or third slide, self-employment has different kind of dimensions. One of the important dimensions that I didn't see, at least in your slides, is this informal. So there's this whole debate about formal versus informal self-employment as well. And so you could have different types of, I mean, this is slightly related to perhaps what Klaus was mentioning, but in general as well, in terms of the education level, let's say, not necessarily ethnicity, but in terms of one graph you showed where the whites were kind of almost constant in terms of the self-employment level, whereas those educated or less educated, like college dropouts, their self-employment was increasing. And I was just wondering, to what extent is that? I mean, part of it is obviously, you mentioned briefly, part of it is corner shop, so a family-run corner shop is part of self-employment, but also there might be quite a lot of informal self-employment, which has in a way detrimental impact compared to entrepreneurship that your title kind of mentions. So I just wanted to say that I know you're probably not covering that, but something to think about in terms of the informal part, which is a huge debate in terms of the self-employment literature.
Yeah, I think there's that's actually the part I think there needs to be a little bit more research on that as well, and that's I didn't get time to talk a little bit about that in my last slide, but there's in the entrepreneurship literature, typically self-employment is kind of the definition to identify the entrepreneurs. So we really need to distinguish between all these different types, including the rise of all those informal workers who identify themselves as self-employed in more recent years. So I think actually that's a area for future studies as well. Yeah. So I agree with you completely.
Gary Fields at, I think, Cornell has done quite a lot of work, so just to...
Okay, I think we need to move to the second presenter. Thank you so much, Chunbei.
Thank you.
And, our second presenter will be Sonia Plaza, about measuring migration.
Let me stop my share.
Thanks. Do we see Sonia?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. I guess everybody was here before and then just disappeared.
Thank you. So, good morning. I have two things to present, but I will present one first and the other just to, the second one is in the future, just to motivate the importance of having migration data and why we will believe in that. So let me share with you my screen. So I don't know if you can see, could you see my screen? Sure.
That's good.
Okay, perfect. So when we started the preparation of this paper, we were basically trying to make the case, the importance of measuring migration and the importance of measuring remittances and diaspora, okay, data. Chunbei has been talking about there's no data available, and then if we review and we check what is all data available in terms of migration and remittances and in what data we use to base of estimation, we are going to be very surprised that there's no data available neither on migration, neither on remittances, despite we wanted things. So let's go and see how we can do. So the motivation is COVID hit all of us, and there was an immediate need to monitor COVID-19, how it's impacted on remittances, how it impacted on migration. And what happens? No tools, no country, nobody knows where their migrants were stranded. They didn't know how many migrants were returning. There was no way to collect that data. And in the data that we're supposed to be having a little bit more of information, which is on the remittances side, nothing, because we needed to have frequent remittances to monitor what happened, the impact of COVID-19. So what happened is that several of the countries that used to report remittances every 3 months start reporting monthly, and now they're monitoring even weekly. No, so this is just to motivate what is going on. At the same time, COVID presented an opportunity because there's a new types of migration data that are becoming available. Everybody's talking about the mobile phones, online services, social networks, and different geospatial data. If this is working, can we use this to collect some data on migration or not? So let's go a little bit and see. were with me. Okay, yes. So in terms of migration data, the migration data stocks that we have available for the world, especially the data that the UNDESA collects, only 94% of the countries have that data. And then it's 218 countries out of the 232. But if we look at the countries in Africa and several countries, let's give you an example. Do you think that we have data available for Lebanon? No, they haven't taken census for a long time. So several countries have even not census for the last 20 years. So getting any data on migration stocks is very important. Second, this data, even that we have on the migration data on stocks, doesn't include the return migration, doesn't include the transit migrants, doesn't include newcomers that are coming. So sometimes this data is not being is very representative of what happened in the field. And the same happened with the remittances flows. The remittances flows are underestimated because they are unrecorded. A lot of them that were going to informal channels. And all the data that is presented on migration stocks is also underestimated because several of the undocumented migrants are never counted in a country. So basically we are facing with an incomplete data on migration stocks. The data is available through the censuses. Now we are going to have a bigger gap because the majority of the census were going to be implemented in 2020 in several of the countries. United States was able to implement it 2020 during the COVID, but several of the countries that were going to be implemented this round census have been delayed. So I don't know when of these countries are going to be implemented the census. We have population registers and we have a national representative service. Now, if we put together all the data on stocks that, for example, UNDESA, Eurostat, OECD, put together, when we compare the data, none of the data harmonized. Some of the data comes from their own countries that they report, but there are issues on the harmonization of the definitions. And we have a very limited data on migration flows. So the same happened when if we wanted to discuss about the diaspora. The main sources for the diaspora is the census of population registers, and it's very difficult to disaggregate this diaspora for second generation, first generation, and there's no clear definition. The only country that more or less published data on diaspora is India. And if we wanted to see right now, the current stock of migrants in the world is 280.5 million. This data has been calculated before the COVID-19. At this moment, there have been some returns, so some of the stock can be reduced, but also at the same time, it has been increased because there have been some other movements along new patterns of migration. So in order to discuss a little bit why this data has been used, and I wanted to give you an example, is new data is coming in terms of how we can use big data as a potential. Some researchers have been using Twitter where the tweets are posted. However, people can be tweeting from different parts of the world. It doesn't mean that that is a migrant, okay? Origin of the migrants. They said, okay, we identify the migration because in the language that you use in Twitter. But just to give you an example, I tweet in 3 languages. No, sometimes I tweet in Spanish, other times I put something in French, and then I tweet in English. So which is the language? How they recognize that I'm a migrant? So that's another thing that we have a problem. Then there are problems with the mobile phone data. There have been some papers that have been trying to analyze if really the mobile phone data really determine the flows, and they have been tracking using the mobile the Venezuelans leaving Colombia to Ecuador or reaching to Peru. However, this is not working because the migrants immediately start changing the chip when they move from country to country or they change something. So again, we cannot be able to capture the real flows. This has been proved in one paper. Now, using mobile or using telephones as a survey also, we have been doing that to collect the data for the COVID-19. And unfortunately, there's a huge bias because only you can capture the data for the people who have funds or in the higher income of the distribution. So there's a huge bias and there's a need to correct for that bias. So we have to look at that. Now, the big advantage is this helps to observe the movements in real time, but the model have to be refined. They have to be developed better. It's an opportunity, but I don't think at this moment it will help us to establish the migration flows or the migration stocks. There has been previous analysis to use the geospatial, especially to monitor the flows on the disasters or in the floods, on the earthquakes, has been helpful, but it helps more for internal migration because for cross-border, as I mentioned before, they changed the chips. But even for internal migration, people have several telephones, for example, in Africa, because there are some monopolistic things. So people have 3 different phones for 3 different chips companies. So is this, you counted for 1, for 2, for 3, how do you count? And then if not, they discarded the phone every time that they need a new ID. So that's the thing that is happening. So then on that things, I would like to share with you a little bit what happened with the impact of data on COVID. What happened at the end is that we didn't have data. When we have to forecast the impact of COVID on remittances, there was no data. None of the models work. And in the first assumption that we did, it was a huge decrease on remittances because we assumed that the economies were going to be contracted completely. And this happens only on the first quarter. All the economies closed. There was no remittance service providers. There was no banks openings. Some of them, they were not working. And in the first quarter, remittances plummeted a lot, but remittances have proven to be resilient and they have continued growing more than it was expected. It's still one of the main foreign exchange or main foreign flows that has been growing and not like in the case of foreign direct investment. Now, this is the graphic that shows how come in the quarter 2 or quarter 3, we can see huge plummet on remittances, and there was no data available to see. This is after how we can expect the behavior, but we have seen some surprises. Remittances has been impacted, COVID have impacted differently across different regions, okay? The only regions where remittances have been increasing and they have not been impacted by the crisis have been Latin America and South Asia, as opposed to the other countries in Europe, Central and East Asia, where has been a big decrease. And contrary to the previous crisis in the financial sector, in Latin America, there was a big recovery. As you can see, what I was mentioning here is you see the huge decrease during May, June, July when it happens, but immediately people start recovering remittances. This could be for 3 reasons. First of all, the stimulus package that several countries, especially the United States, has been given. Second, migrants were in the essential services, but also the third one is what the previous speaker was mentioned. The majority, as you can see, of the Hispanics were in the entrepreneurship and self-employment. So this is explained in a big view why this has happened, why the big remittances continue, because they will continue. Remember that a lot of the fiscal impact has been given for SMEs in the United States, so they receive a several part of that one. There are 2 other hypotheses. The other hypothesis has been that there have been a movement from informal to formal channels, which it could be, but it could be in a one time, because now if you analyze the data, the majority people keep sending still cash, and then they're trying to figure it out how to send it. And the most important, I think, plausible thing is that a lot of migrants were get stuck in transit. They were in Mexico. So you have a lot of Haitians in Mexico, Guatemalans, Honduras that couldn't cross, and also a lot of Haitians in Panama that were coming to the United States. So a lot of the money that is going now to Central America is for a lot of these migrants have been struck and they haven't been able to cross the borders. So the thing is, why and how we can see on the economic impact, and we can see that when there was the crisis, the most impacted were the foreign born and the Hispanics. You can see the line, the orange line is the impact on the labor market participation, unemployment. And then this line now has been recovered. But the ones we have reached now for August 21, we have reached the levels of pre-crisis, especially for the Hispanics. So the Hispanics and the natives, there's no more difference. They have reached the level of the pre-crisis. So finally, the impact on the crisis has been very bad for the foreign-born in several countries in Europe. They have already started in a low level. They never recovered from the financial crisis, and now this continue impacted with all the closing, all the main services. So what is behind of this resilience, and why is important the data? So at the end, we have been showing, despite everything that now is coming into the data, that the willingness of migrants to continue to support families, okay? Now, we don't have migrants stock. We have only some estimations on the undocumented, but these undocumented are helping to on the resilience to continue these remittances. Now, the stimulus package has been very important. So migrants have been undocumented.
Sorry, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm finished. That's my latest slide. And then we have expected better than expected economic performance in many large host countries. So United States, if you see the growth recovery on the GDP growth rates of the host countries, there have been a better than expected. They expected that they were going to be more negative. It's much better. And there have been a shift from cash to digital and informal to formal channels. So for me, it's very clearly that there's 3 key messages in order to analyze now the impact of COVID, not only the COVID, any analysis that we wanted to do on migration and remittance. Whatever we're saying, the data is completely inconsistent, is completely unreliable, and whatever regressions that we're taking, I will take it with a grain of salt, okay? And this has been very evident for the case of COVID. Maybe we need to do an international effort to propose a compilation. I know that all the UN agencies, the Global Compact on Migration, U.S.A, are trying to do that, but nothing has been achieved for the last 20, 30 years. So maybe there's a time that we can do some of these efforts. And then I think that is more work needed to reduce bias on big data, because that's the big thing. There's a lot of bias on big data in order to calculate these estimations. Over. Thank you very much.
Perfect timing. Thank you so much. Klaus?
Yes, if nobody wants to raise the hand. So I just wanted to stress 2 things, because this is important for the handbook as such. Whatever what you're presenting here is fine. This is a mixture of what you're doing and what is in the handbook. But it's important to understand that we have an own section on COVID. So 20 chapters will deal with the effects on COVID. So basically, the migration section has to deal with the basic challenges we have on the topic. So this chapter is very important, Sonia. I mean, and your outline, I know your outline is fulfilling correctly what we intensively what we are doing. And want to do so to see how can we define migration as such already has been, and how much is this reflected in the data, and how much are there problems with it. Yes, that's a very important issue. In particular, then also what can we do in the future when we exactly what you're mentioning, virtual mobility will become huge and important and very difficult, even more difficult to measure than before. So what are the challenges and what can one do? So in that direction. So that on the other hand, it's of course very, very interesting what you reported, that remittances went up so dramatically recently. So my knowledge up to the second was that nothing, I mean, it would go down now heavily. Has this to do with people just moving down with their financial resources to help families at home, or maybe planning to move home earlier because they are losing jobs in the host countries and so on, and so planning to move down the stocks of resources? That's certainly a very interesting topic for research, because this is completely, in my view, unexpected so far.
Thank you. Okay.
Did you want to respond or do you want?
Yeah, no, very quickly. Yes, I put it COVID because I wanted to motivate, because when we started, the COVID was not there. So data on migration was very important. But when COVID hit, it became even more important. So I wanted to illustrate the need to have data. But yes, the chapter look at the basic challenges on the definitions, on the harmonization, on the short term versus a long term, how you define, there's nothing on how do you define migrants, how do you define a diaspora, and remittance as a definition, but all the challenges to collect the data and to work on that with the countries now, and how we can do in the future is very good. But in terms of remittances, there's the hypothesis, and it has been proved this time, that there's a counter-cyclical of remittances, because remittance has been proven to be resilient in times of crisis and in times of economic and health disasters, okay? But this was proven when it was only in the countries that received the remittances. So when there was that, it was counter-cyclical, everybody wanted to help. This time we have a global pandemic, but despite that all the countries have been impacted, migrants are still sending remittances. That's one part. The second part is that a lot of migrants have returned and they have bring back their savings, okay? And the third part that is still to prove, but it's an area of research that we are doing, is the smuggling. Because there, everything has been crossing, but there's still a lot of push to migrate, because you see all of the migrants in the borders waiting. There have been an increase on the smuggling. Okay, and then what happened is that they're targeted, for example, in the case of the border north of the United States, you can see that Mexico has increased 40% on the volume of remittances. El Salvador, 39%. So huge increases, which is the largest of the largest. So one way to explain, apart from the return, apart from the shift from informal to informal, is that somebody else is receiving the remittances, not only the Mexicans in Mexico's, or not only the Guatemalans in the Guatemala. So yes, in Mexico now there's a large percentage of people looking for asylum or for mixed migration that are Guatemalans, Hondurans, Colombians, Venezuelans, all of that. That's one. But at the same time, the smugglers are charging a higher prices, and what they are doing, the people who are being deported and returned from the United States, they are targeted the ones who have family in the United States. And I can bet that some of that is being paid in that, and that's why it's showing as a remittance. Thank you.
Madeline, did you want to ask a question?
If you need to move on, I'm happy to defer, but otherwise, to follow up a little bit on something Sonia just talked about, as you were presenting it, I was thinking about this situation at the border, that the issue of measuring remittances is much more complicated now when people are in third countries, and so where the money's going. So that's a very interesting and relevant point. The other thing that my students, at least, are really interested in is El Salvador and the Bitcoin, and what is going to happen with that, and what would that mean for a country that's so remittance dependent, and then for us as researchers trying to track it. So,
thank you.
Thoughts on that?
Exactly, on the third countries, we are trying to figure it out. I can bet, for example, that a lot of the huge increase that is going into Pakistan is going out of the roof also in terms of remittance. They have put some incentives, okay, to facilitate the remittances. They're paying 1 point or 2 points more as a savings, but I can bet that some part of that remittance is going to Afghanistan. Is the same that is happening in Colombia. In Colombia, you will see a huge increase of remittances, but what? Because Venezuela is completely closed. So a lot of the remittances are going to be to Colombia and then channel to Venezuela. So that's one. On the Bitcoin and El Salvador, yes, we are trying to do a box because we are trying to follow out what will happen with El Salvador. Is this going to happen with this wallet called El Chivo? No, we are following that thing to see what's the position from the World Bank is that this is not going to be helping, but as a researchers, we can look at that, what is going on. And Zimbabwe also wanted to do the same. So maybe this is a way that they wanted to see if they have problems to access to foreign exchange, but yes, not yet. Thank you. Thank you, Madeline.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we do need to move on now. I have questions for you too, but I will send you an email. Thank you, Sonia. Okay, next is Davit.
Well, actually, it will be me presenting. So
sorry, I don't hear.
Yeah.
That was the name that was highlighted. Mariola.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, that's great.
Okay, so we are writing on the determinants of migration, which is pretty broad, and I know some of the chapters are actually going into more deeply into those factors. So my understanding is that I will just more or less like touch on the surface to tell a story, like what is explaining migration. And so we are going to first introduce the chapter with some few graphs on the global migration. And as Sonia was just saying, and we all know, like there are of course like problems with getting data. We are going to base some of these graphs on the migration data set that I was collecting also previously based on the national statistical offices, and that we are at the moment updating up to 2020. And then we are going to say or like give an overview of theoretical contributions, and then the recent empirical literature. And then at the end of the chapter, we are going to discuss, problems with data, methodology, and space for improvement to the future, and also tell something about the areas that should be probably researched more in the future. So that's quite a lot to be covered, and so we are not completely going deeply into those particular factors that much. So here I just have a few few graphs that are based on the UN data and from the International Organization of Migration. So just to show that the migration or the number of foreigners increased in all parts of the world, but it is very significant in the developed part of the world, Northern America and Europe, but and also in Asia, which is mostly driven by Arabic countries. And then also like to say that it's spatially differently distributed where the migrants go to. But I'm going to have, in the chapter, I'm going to have graphs based on this international migration data set, which we are actually finalizing and just going through the like second check. And in those trends, yes, we observe these, growing mixed origin of migrants, and going towards more migrants from less developed countries, and going through the channels of refugee and family reunion migration. And also like in that historical circumstances, also like one important factor was also the fall of Iron Curtain and EU enlargements and the migration from east to west, and of course, still understanding migration determinants is very important, for policymakers as well. So we need to have better understanding. And so here I'm probably not going to spend much time on that theory. So, and we all are familiar. So I'm just in that chapter, I'm just reviewing starting from the neoclassical migration theory and, focusing more on the human capital investment model that also serves a base most of the time for the empirical modeling. So I'm reviewing those, telling also about, we are also telling about possible extensions of the model that were done. Then we mentioned shortly the decision of migration as a family or on the household level, and the work by Odette Stark and other authors that are contributing here. We are, of course, reviewing with a greater detail the gravity theory that also is partly the base for the empirical contributions here, yeah. And we mentioned as well some the other theories of migration, such as segmented labor market theory, the world system theory, and we spent some time as well on the network theory of migration, based on the work by some sociologists, Massey and Coulters and others. And we also mentioned that actually the network theory is also helping to explain why migration can continue even though the economic differences between countries are vanishing, and it's because of these networks of family, friends, and other co-ethnic. And here we also mention some theories that are kind of in line with network theory, and that's the contributions by Thomas Bauer and Epstein, where we have the lack of information driving immigrants towards the destinations where previous migrants were going, or the head effects. Okay, and so this just shortly, so we go through the existing theoretical contributions, and then starting with the empirical literature. Here, majority of the empirical studies, they are coming or basing their empirical specification on the human capital model combined with the gravity model, and most of them, they come up with some kind of equations like here, where we have on the left hand side the migration rate, and some studies are using the gross migration flows, some net migration flows based on the difference in stocks, and some are using the stock of immigrants. So it all depends what kind of data they have available. And earlier studies, they focus only on migration to one country, or first more countries, but on cross-section. Then we have the more panel data studies. And on the right hand side, we have a number of these push-pull factors with economic factors, with the proxy for diaspora, that is usually considered the stock of immigrants from the same origin. Then we have the distance variable, which are extended recently, not only to consider the physical distance and the dummy for neighborhood in country, but we have a number of cultural and linguistic distances. And then we have a number of variables in the X, Y, J, T matrix, where we have different factors on the state level, I don't know, political instability, wars, ethnic conflicts, as well as climate, environmental factors, climate change, and so on. And then the studies have also control for destination and origin fixed effects, and the time fixed effects. So this is the usual empirical specification most of the studies arrive from, and they kind of focus on those different explanatory variables, and more recently they focus also on interplay of those. And so we review this, determinants, and as you all know, in the economic variables seems to be the systematic evidence that the pull factors are more important than the push factors, and basically that it's along the human capital model, the improved economic situation in destinations is pulling more migration out of less developed the less developed regions, countries. And also there's an evidence on the existence of liquidity constraint, where improvement in economic conditions in origins may initially increase migration. Under those economic determinants, we have as well the welfare migration, where we also review the literature and give an evidence that there's more mixed evidence on that, with earlier studies finding more positive effect of welfare pool, so the existence of a welfare magnet, whereas more recent evidence, or more also evidence on a macro level, is showing no welfare magnet existence. Then there are some studies, recent studies, that are going more deeply into types of welfare benefits. And for example, the most recent study by Young and co-authors, where they distinguish between unemployment, family, and old age benefits, and they show that family benefits are significantly influencing young families with children, and old age benefits are actually influencing the more senior people, whereas they find no evidence on unemployment benefits as a factor. So that there's growing also evidence here. Yeah, so and then also a couple of studies on income inequality, and basically as a documentation of relative deprivation, all that stark theoretical contributions that also show that income inequality actually is playing a role. Then there's a huge area of studies that look at the effects of diaspora and the networks of migrants, that basically is helping the immigrants to reallocate and to settle. And there are quite some studies that are documenting that basically the immigration flows are larger to destinations which have a larger stock of individuals from the same country of origin. Okay, and that also is just saying, and some maybe novelty here, that basically networks also help to, there's some interplay of factors, and actually networks also help to explain some selection in migration. So it seems like the networks are more important for more poor people, but also there's selectivity with respect to skills. So it seems that networks are more important to less skilled individuals.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, so
thank you.
And then I review some of the linguistic distance and the role of language, where I have some work and kind of say the development in the literature, as well as mention the role of widely spoken language in that, the role of English. Then I suggest that I review the environmental migration, but not so deeply, because I know that there's a Shuzang Chai that has the chapter that goes deeply into the environmental migration. So just review the recent developments and potential channels via the of migration caused by climate or environmental factors. Then there's an entire bunch of studies looking at the role of the state, and here I mean the immigration policy, which is quite limited, also because we do not have good measure of immigration policy. And there are some of the contributions also by me and some co-authors on immigrant rights and in destinations and how they are pulling the immigrants. So just reviewing that fast. And then one of the last parts will be on political factors. In that, political instability, ethnic conflicts and wars, and different typology of wars and ethnic conflicts, which is really quite limited area at the moment. And so I review did those very like a couple, basically 3 studies that are in there on international migration, and a couple of studies that look on like one country evidence with a better identification. And
Okay.
one of
Time is up. Thank you.
Okay, so I will not maybe just like very quickly about you know, my idea on like telling like in that area that what kind of problems we have in particular regarding endogeneity concerns, reverse causality, that it's not really solved that much in determinants of migration. And then I also would like to discuss future research endeavors, in particular improving the migration data availability, and then understanding more about the political factors, environmental factors, and different types of migration. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Questions?
Well, if nobody else, let me just drop the point. Thank you very much for this big effort. But the importance is to understand this. While there are 600 chapters in total, there are a few dozens of chapters on migration. So sometimes people think who have a specific topic on migration, think they should write about all parts of migration. So this is not true. So there are some basic chapters who should provide the idea in some kind of core areas, and then there are more specific chapters. So certainly the chapter Determinants of Migration should focus on the determinants of migration and be broadly core. So attitudes, just as an example, attitudes towards migrants is not belonging to this chapter, yes? Because this is about what natives think about migrants, yes? Okay, this may have an effect on migration determination, I understand. Okay, I understand all the, but so the importance here is you have 20 pages, so to speak, yes, to focus on what is core and relevant, what are the major theories, and what are the major relevant empirical findings we have, yes. If you all talk about that wage differentials are so important, but at the end it's just networks, yes, then we need to know it. I mean, just as an example, yes, and so on. So you're in principle on the right track, but it's, I think you cannot have all what you are presenting us, you cannot have that in the chapter, and there would be lots of overlaps with others. So that is my advice, so to speak.
All right, so so if I understand, I should write it more as a story, basically on which factors are seem to be out of the literature most important for migration determinants in the review of empirical literature. So I knew that I cannot go deeply into those because I knew, you know, there are other chapters, but I thought I should give an overview somehow, at least like touching on the surface. So I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, if you look into, let's say, if this would be a textbook, yes, on migration, there are textbooks, of course, but if this would be textbooks, that you would have on migration, you would have at the beginning a kind of overview. And Sonia Plaza, for instance, has a chapter of defining what is migration, what are relevant facts. And so not all the other migration chapters later on can bring the same kind of let's say, empirical trends or whatever, because then we have lots of replication. That's why we are talking here. That's why we have these meetings, to understand it better. So focus on, and if you need advice, yes, I mean, of course, you can review. You can say, okay, we have all these types of determinants, environmental, forced migration, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But we have a chapter on forced migration. Yes, we have a chapter. Yes, we have a chapter on refugee policies and so on. They will take up, but the conceptual, but all these chapters cannot repeat again what makes the choice, why are people moving and whatever. So they will have to refer to your chapter. So that's the kind of the strategy. Yes, and of course you will get more comments in the process, but that's also why we have these kind of workshops to find out what people are doing, because everybody works on his own somehow and needs direction.
Thank you, Klaus.
Thanks.
Should we keep going? We're like 7 minutes behind, and a bunch of us still have to go, if that's okay. And yeah, Mariola, I just had there was a lot there, so I think we can follow up afterwards. And so in the interest of time, the next person is Max. Max, are you ready to go?
I am.
Okay.
Let's see whether I can manage to do.
I'll give you a 2-minute warning, and then we've been doing about 5 minutes of Q&A.
Yep. I hope this. Okay, very good. So this is a chapter on migration and education, and a chapter which has been co-written with Matloob, and I'm quite happy that Matloob is here. If there is one thing that this chapter is about, is a chapter about imperfect markets or imperfections that occur, in the sense that migration and education intertwine quite a lot. They are typically studied as the result of an optimization problem. They are studied jointly or sequentially, but there are a lot of imperfections that characterize both the decision to migrate, the decision to get educated, and the connection between the two. So what we try to do is to fill in this gap about imperfection in quite a crowded space, because in the past 10 years, there have been quite a number of reviews of the link between migration and education, as you can see below. So what do we do? Well, we have 9 sections. As I said, our focus is on imperfections. And apart from the introduction and the conclusions, we cover a number of aspects which I will discuss now. So we start with a traditional model. So people compare wages in different countries or expected wages, and they decide to migrate if the returns are higher in the host country. Now, there is a very important mechanism at work besides or behind this comparison, which is the fact that people generally self-select. Migrants do self-select, and that is quite an implication, because in the traditional way, the self-selection means that there is competition between people who have the same level or the same characteristics as natives, in substitution, in the case of education, across levels of education. So if I am a skilled migrant, I complement an unskilled migrant, so someone with lower education, and vice versa, but I compete directly with someone with the same level of education, and there is quite a literature that covers that. However, in more recent developments in the theory or in the empirics of migration, depending on how you want to look at them, we realize that education gives a set of competences, and these competences do cover a heterogeneous space within jobs. So jobs are not just one homogeneous thing. They include several tasks. These tasks require competences, and therefore the fact that you have a person doing the same job doesn't mean that the person uses or carries out the same task with the same intensities as one does. as a result of which there is less direct competition between migrants and natives. Jobs are specific very often to countries. And so we have to be mindful of two things. Number one, there is, yes, less competition or less direct competition between migrants and natives. On the other hand, because jobs tend to be specific, or the tasks tend to be specific, or the knowledge in the task tends to be specific, what happens is that we can observe this limited phenomenon of transferability of human capital. And here is when we start looking at the imperfections. So we look at imperfections in the sense of prices. So we see that migrants tend to have a lower return to education when that education is acquired in the country of origin, but some education in the host country can help recover what one had, what human capital one had sort of built up in the country of origin. And in terms of quantity, what we observe is this phenomenon of over-education, which exists from countries like India to countries in Europe to Australia, New Zealand, and also in the US. Now, a strong sort of evidence was put forward at the beginning, say, look, over-education is something normal because you finish your education and do not immediately have all the expertise that is required by employers in the labor market. You need to build it up. And so you finish your university with a high qualification, but you may start with a modest job to start building up the expertise. And then over time, your education serves to get to the level of expertise required by the job. But what it has been observed is that this mismatch between education and the type of job tends to persist in the labor market. And there are a variety of causes that have been investigated, but there are also some effects which we point out. One element which has clearly come up, and you know, in this I have to acknowledge sort of Klaus' discussion and contribution. Say, look, you know, there is migration and education, but there is also migration for education, in the sense that in the case of Australia, unless you have a certain level of education, you cannot legally migrate. Sometimes people migrate because they need to get expertise that they cannot get in their home country. There is no specific lab that does that particular thing that one wants to do. You have to go to more specialized locations. This migration for education is interesting because it is recognized even by the country of origin, by the host countries, because the returns for people trained abroad tend to be higher. And the contribution is also beneficial to the host country, as it has been seen in terms of contribution of foreign students to, for example, production of knowledge and patents and so forth. Now, here we come to the fact of the original comparison that migrants may make between what they could earn at home and what they could earn or what their education can earn them in the place of destination. And information is not perfect by any means. And in the case of a certain type of migration, especially from Africa to Europe, it is seen that people are quite prepared to accept death as a possible outcome in order to obtain certain expected return in the places of origin. So migrants seem to be fairly ignorant about what's going on for real in the host country, but employers too are ignorant of the education, or at least the signal value of education from a country of origin. And the discrimination that often is seen in the labor market may not just be discrimination based on the desire to create differences between people of different origins, but could just be statistical discrimination. And it's something that it is observed and can also be remedied with local signals, for example. We also look at the effect that social networks and ethnic groups can make on trying to fill this information gap between country of origin and country of destination. In general, there is a positive influence of the social networks or this ethnic group, even though sometimes the ethnicity or the social network is what keep people stuck in a particular situation, because a migrant arrives, relies on the social network in order to find job. The social network doesn't have perfect knowledge of what's going on in the country, offers maybe a local job, which maybe is not of such a high quality to the migrant who arrives, and the migrant somewhat gets stuck, and there is some evidence of that. But the fact that the returns to education of migrants seem to be lower than what natives seem to get is also influenced by institutional setting. So on the one hand, immigration policy tend to focus overwhelmingly on formal education. And that may create a problem if what you want, or what a country wants, are highly motivated migrants who do contribute new companies, new enterprises. And so the emphasis on formal education may exclude people who potentially are extremely successful entrepreneurs and innovators. And that could be a problem. There is another type of problem or institutional problem that exists, which is the presence of occupational licensing in several countries. And occupational licensing is something that covers both highly professionalized jobs, especially all the jobs that have to deal with third-party liability, but also jobs that require a vocational education. So if you're an electrician, if you're a gas fitter, you need to have a license. And it has been shown that migrants, even though have the qualifications to enter in those professions because they have a degree in architecture, in medicine, in engineering, find enormous difficulties to get into the profession because of the barriers posed by occupational licensing. Finally, migrants are also susceptible or influenced by the quality of the institution where in the country of destination, and they affect voting behaviors of natives. Now, we try to conclude the chapter with areas where we haven't seen much research, but could be interesting. So there is a lot of literature on describing this imperfect transferability of human capital from one country to the other. We don't really know exactly why. There are some hypotheses that have been advanced, but probably more can be done in that area. Especially with this mismatch between education and occupation, we don't really know what the causes are. Some studies have shown that there are intergenerational effects. So the kids of overeducated migrants tend to reduce the gap with of their parents only by half, even though maybe they're born in the host country. We don't really know that much on the returns to education of international students when, for example, they go back, especially in countries that do not have English as an official language. And then there is this potential mismatch between labor market policies and immigration policies. So the classic case is where immigration tries to be selective, but migrants cannot enter into professions because in the labor market, entry to professions is regulated by associations that are basically insider clubs that don't let the migrants come in. So even though you may have an open policy towards certain type of individuals, there may be difficulties in actually using them appropriately in the labor market. And
so you have like 1 minute, if that's okay. It seems like you're almost done. Thank you.
That's absolutely fine. And this in fact where we're ending up. So again, a chapter on imperfection. We couldn't put all the literature we wanted to, but suggestion that you have we'll be very happy to receive. So thanks very much.
Thank you. It was actually perfect timing. I didn't want to cut you off.
Excellent.
If nobody wants to make suggestions, what to include else or whatever, or take out, I should start conceptually. Conceptually, it's clear that with the whole project there will be lots of overlaps. Yes, and it has to be overlapped. We look at the same body of what's happening from a different angle. Yes. There is let's say, a section on conflict. Yes, nevertheless, will be some of you will write on conflict. This is maybe even use the same literature. Yes, that's not the issue, but the focus should be different. So the focus here is to have education as a key point. Of course, education determines the move between countries, or it also has an effect on the performance in a country, or but on the outcome of the visit. I mean, do I get a degree or not, or whatever. So this can be covered in other parts, but this section here should now systematically look, let's say, also on the issues over and under education and so on. So that's my first. That's not a problem. On the other hand, you all need to have a focus. Yes, and the whole focuses have to together build up the hopefully most of the knowledge we have on the topic in general. So that's a kind of concept, just to let you know what I have in mind. And the other, by a footnote, the instructions, at least the older ones of Springer Nature, had this misunderstanding on literature. Yes, if you still get letters or have gotten letters saying you have to cut down your literature to the most relevant, that's not right. You use the literature you need to have, and I would not say the more the better, but what is relevant has to be in and can be in. And in a way, while we aim at a middle length of 20 pages, so to speak, or 10,000 words, we have no real upper and lower level. Yes, I mean, we can have a shorter piece and longer pieces. So don't worry. I mean, just as a general information, which is often overlooked, since we have a few seconds or not time. Okay. So otherwise, I'm fine. I have no further comments to Max and Matloob at this stage.
Okay, then. Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay.
It's 1:41 in the morning here in Sydney, so it's a full day for me tomorrow. So I will disappear.
Good night.
Just say thanks
so much
to
for
everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, the fifth presenter is Cinzia, presenting on performance of economic migrants.
Thank you very much. I'll share my screen. Can you see?
Good.
Yeah, sorry, I just need to. Okay, I just want to move. Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity to Klaus to contribute to this fantastic project. So I thought I would start providing you an overview of the chapter. So my contribution to the handbook is on performance of economic migrants. So the way I structured the chapter is the following. I start with a general introduction, and then I focus on two particular labor market outcomes that measure the performance of migrants, i.e. employment and wages. So within employment, I start talking about unemployment and how unemployment between migrants and natives difference, also how the job choices and characteristics evolve over time, and how also the changing composition of immigrants has interacted and still interacts with this outcome. And then I move to wages and the economic assimilation. And I focus on various determinants of wages and economic assimilation, but I particularly focus on something that, you know, previous contribution already mentioned, which is the transferability of skills, but also the role of education, language proficiency, and also how economic assimilation of migrants act towards the natives. And then I conclude the fourth part of the chapter is on specific issues. So I focus on two sectors which I felt were a little bit understudied. So one is on immigrant in economic crisis. Sonia earlier on, you know, provided us some slides showing that immigrants are more likely to be unemployed over the crisis. But I don't think that much has been done, and also on female migrants. So let me go into a little bit more of detail. Sorry, I just want to move this. Okay, so this chapter presents the state of art of empirical research on performance on economic migrants and everything that, you know, also people in this panel have contributed, we've read, we studied in the past 40 years or even more. So it draws mainly on labor economics contribution, discussing the extension of the analysis, considering different roles, determinants, but also the evolution of immigrant economic performance. And I also touch about the empirical and methodological challenges that researchers have faced over time. So how we started, I mean, we know that how well migrants do in the receiving country and how fast they converge and they assimilate to the economic performance of natives remain a core topic in empirical studies of immigrants. And it's difficult to start a chapter on economic performance of economic migrant assimilation without mentioning the work of Chiswick in the 1970s. So Chiswick provided with one of the key facts about the performance of economic migrants, which was earnings of recently arrived immigrants in the United States are significantly lower than those of natives. So following up from Chiswick, there has been a huge literature, which, you know, I try to summarize and review in this chapter. And then, of course, from Chiswick, the empirical research has widely progressed from several points of view: methodology, focus, contribution, and this particularly the evidence and the findings of different literature has been partially the result, on one hand, by the evolving characteristic of migrants. On the other hand, it's also been the result of better quality data and information on immigration experience. So we know there have been quite a lot of conversation between Chisik and Borjas in the 70s and 80s, and they were discussing a lot about cross-section data and how they were suitable or not to understand the performance of economic migrants. So just to provide you with the main findings, there are pretty much common, or where research also might disagree about the performance on economic migrants. So while it is true that immigrants and natives have historically had different employment rates, it's also true that this has changed and has evolved over time. So in most recent decades, employment rate of immigrant men, for example, has been substantially higher than that of natives. This is particularly the case for the UK. Another key finding is that the job search behavior of migrants are likely to be different from those on natives for several reasons. First of all, the difference stays in the fact that migrants are more likely to use informal channels rather than formal channels, particularly referring to the migrants who have just arrived in the country. And also job characteristics also evolve over time. This refers particularly for migrants who just arrived in the country, who are more subject to different or temporary contractual arrangements. But then as the longer they stay in the country, they experience occupational upgrading, and then they will find jobs. They are more in line, they match more their skills. So the patterns, evolution, and experience of integration in the host countries are due to various and critical factors that could represent a constraint or could facilitate the economic assimilation of migrants. So first of all is location choice. It's pretty clear that migrants tend to concentrate to move in areas, not only where there are other migrants that could represent for a channel of informal information, but also they tend to locate where there are more job opportunities, so the level of employment is higher. And also migrants tend to invest more in skills and learning, and this is particularly an initial time when they are in the country. And so this will allow them to then move to better opportunities, so to assimilate better with natives. And the time spent in the host country is crucial. There is a sort of agreement in the literature that for migrants to assimilate, to become, similar, if you like, to natives takes about 10 to 15 years. So the time spent in the host country is crucial because migrants not only can acquire skills they need, the learning they need, but also can acquire the knowledge of the labor market or the laws of the channel, not only informal, but also more formal channels. And needless to say, the personal characteristics and skills are also crucial, particularly a major factor behind wage assimilation is due to the fact that transferability of human capital is imperfect. Max had mentioned that earlier on. So not all the skills and the human capital that migrants acquire in their own country can be transferred easily or can be transferred at all to the receiving country. So this could be a major factor that could at least at the beginning, when migrants arrive, represent a constraint. And the level of education and language proficiency are crucial factors, and there is consensus from various parts of the literature that high level of education and good language proficiency increase the employment opportunity, but also allows migrants to have a faster wage assimilation in the hosting country. And also more recently, there has been a couple of papers from Germany and also for the Scandinavian countries showing that the impact on language training on employment success of immigrants seems to be, language training seems to be relevant as well. So as I mentioned, one of the area which is perhaps a little bit understudied is economic crisis. So we experience several economic and social crises. We can think about the most recent pandemic, but also the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And it is clear that immigrants are more vulnerable for the natives for many reasons. They are certainly more exposed to negative labor market shocks following economic crisis, and migrants are part of the population group that most of the time are bearing the burden of economic downturns. They are more vulnerable than natives for various reasons. As I said, one reason is because they are concentrated in sectors that are more sensitive to economic and financial crisis. Think about constructions, for example, and also due to the contractual arrangements. But also labor market outcomes are more pro-cyclical among migrants than native workers. And this, as I said, there is not much literature, but what is there? There is quite a bit of consensus about it. And then another gap that is, there is some bit of research gap is about economic performance of female migrants. Most of the literature that I review in this chapter uses data that are most of the time based on male only. Of course, there are, practical reasons. Female are often not included. Most of the literature in the 80s and the 70s of the data, we know that the labor market participation of women was lower, so the sample sizes for female migrants was lower, but also it's also true that the analysis for including female is more complicated due to fertility decision, care responsibilities, but it does not mean that it's less important. So perhaps, more effort should be done in future. However, despite being more limited, existing research has pointed out that there are differences between male and female migrants. So the gender gap differences is even more pronounced among migrants than it is among natives. And again, the reasons are various. Language seems to be more important for men than women. This could be because often women do not work. They live in the main work is to have care responsibility, at least for some part of the migration population. And there are differences as well in the level of education, although, as I mentioned, there has been a change over time. And social norms and beliefs about the women's role in society is also appear to be an important part, has been highlighted in the literature to be crucial in the how much female can assimilate in the labor market. And of course, female composition, investment in human capital is particularly important for the economic assimilation of female immigrants. And I think with this, I've done. So if you have any comment, question, and anyone willing to read the chapter, I would be very happy to share it.
Great, that was perfect timing. Thank you. I didn't even have to give you a warning. I actually have a couple questions, but I'll Klaus go if he wants to go. It's hard for me to see the screen.
Well, maybe since I talk too much, maybe you start first and I go second.
I'm really interested in the work that you just presented at the end about women. And I was wondering, when you were doing that literature search, did you find much on women and remittances, and also immigrant women and marriage? Those are just two areas I've been doing research on.
I'm going to use, as my answer, I'm going to use what Klaus said before. And the reason is that, I mean, I did focus more, the focus was really on the economic migrants. So I just was trying to consider what are the factors, the roles, what have we learned. So I didn't, I know there is another chapter on remittances, and the same, I did mention, the child care responsibility and the time, the way time is used is crucial. I do mention that in terms of marriage. So there is something which I do mention, but I did not expand too much. So again, I just was keeping the focus and looking at the papers that really focus on the labor market outcomes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm perfectly fine with the outline and with the focus and structure, because, well, there are many other things, yes, which are missing in general, but the question is where to put. For instance, when we look at migrants who are coming, let's say as economic migrants, that's the focus of this chapter.
Exactly.
Then the question is, there could be many other things, what they contribute to even the labor markets. They bring with them kids, yes, or they may have kids later. So the next generation, if you talk about performance of migrants, yes, as such, could also be very much affected. People can come in low skilled, but have high skilled kids, let's say, like the Asian migrants to the United States, just as an example. And now the question is, where do we cover this? Yes, well, that could be only a small section, if at all, but I don't see at the moment where we cover it in the handbook in general. Do you have, I mean, not only Cynthia, but also the others, are there any advices for me what we should do? It would not fit in your chapter, yes, isn't it?
Well, I think so. I did read. I think that do mention there are some papers that talk about second generation sort of things, right? And I think it's something very recent. But the thing is, if you start talking about, of course, it is connected. But then I would probably think it would be a whole second, another chapter. I mean, I could do a subsection, but then I'm not really sure, it will change things, to be honest. Because it's more on the, those who arrive. So, because then there are other issues, so second generation, how the parents transmit, the value and the knowledge to the second generation. And so there are also, issues about how do we identify, second generation migrants sort of thing. So it would be a bit more complex, I would say, to include in this one. It will change a bit the focus. I do mention something, but as I said,
it cannot play a major role. Otherwise, you would miss our major. I understand that. So if nobody volunteers at the moment from other chapters, I will think about how to handle this. Let me just make a general comment because this often comes up, and I should repeat this again and again. Now, in terms of sharing, yes. So first, we are presenting at these workshops papers who are already published in the handbook. And others who are not even finished as a draft. Yes, so in this whole process, sharing is perfectly okay, including the finished paper, published paper. Of course, Springer does not want and that we put it online easily. Yes, I mean, that's clear. But you all have access to it, and it's no problem to share that with your students, with your colleagues, and so on, blah, blah. And the same is also with papers which are not yet in the process. So we encourage everybody, there's no problem, like with journal articles, to put it in a discussion paper series. For instance, the GLO discussion paper series. You're not nervous where you put it, but it's possible to do it, and then we can also have more access to it. We want to create noise around the project, yes, and we want to improve. So next thing is, it will take a while, but then it will be also physically published with books, and this will be repeated. All papers can be updated, yes, and can be new variants online yes. So those papers who are already finished now and published, they are also debated because, well, in the future we want to keep it fresh. So that's a kind of ideology, just to keep you. I hope to be friends. We hope to be friends for longer in this project, so to speak, in a way. Yes. Okay. So these were kind of the marks. So maybe if I hold back and let Cynthia.
stop
Bansak.
share then.
So I'm the last one to go unless people have questions for Cinzia. Okay, and both Madeline and Nicole are here. They're my co-authors on the paper, and I will get started. Okay. Can everybody see that and hear me? Can someone just say something? I can't see. Okay, awesome. Okay, well, thank you. And I'll keep my own time, I guess, but I know we're already running late. So thank you very much for including us today and including us in the handbook. Our chapter is a pretty solid draft, and we're very happy to share it with you. I'll be giving an overview of this chapter. It's co-authored with Nicole Simpson and Madeline Zavodny. They're both here today, and it's looking at immigrants and their effects on labor market outcomes of natives. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to give a very brief summary of what's contained, and we're happy to share a draft of what we have. Okay, so in this chapter, we look at the impact of foreign-born workers on the labor market outcomes of natives. And in interest of time, rather than motivated, as I was going to do a little bit earlier, I just want to say what we cover are the main theoretical and empirical models, and we discuss how the predictions of them and the empirical results that we find. We highlight key findings in the literature, and we stress a lot about the assumptions, both in the theoretical models and the empirical models. In a nutshell, the main findings are that the empirical research doesn't find much of an effect on natives' earnings and employment, mostly in the medium and high income countries that we're focusing on and that we found papers on. And I think part of our contribution is to just stress the different assumptions in these models, and both theoretically and empirically. And then we do discuss other channels and other outcomes, and give areas for future research. So this is what the structure of the chapter looks like. We have 7 models that we present, theoretical models, 4 empirical models. We talk about other channels, other ways other than through wages and labor that immigrants can affect native-born workers, and then give some areas for future research. Okay. So there are 7 models. I'm not going to go over all of them in detail, but the major workhorse one that we've seen over and over, and we start with the 3 assumptions that labor supply is perfectly inelastic. So you have a vertical labor supply curve. All workers, both natives and immigrants, are perfect substitutes, and we're holding capital fixed. And in this model, you start at the intersection of the initial supply and initial demand. You have wages and labor, and then when there's immigrants, it's a rightward shift, and you see downward pressure on wages, increased labor, and the native-born workers are still employed, but at lower wages. So this is, the starting point that it's textbook type theory, and then the next thing you do is you relax the first assumption. And so I'm going to walk you through some of the models, not all of them in detail, but this is how we introduce it. We give the underpinnings of the theoretical work, and then we go on to the empirical work. So then we relax the assumption that labor supply is perfectly inelastic, and now we have an upward labor supply for the native-born workers. The immigrants still have a inelastic labor supply. We have an equation where we have upward sloping labor supply, with omega there being the coefficient on wages, which gives you the positive relationship between wages and labor supply. And in this case, when there's an increase in immigrants, you see lower wages and increased labor again. But in this case, native-born workers are some of them do not supply their labor to the labor market anymore because of the upward sloping labor supply and the lower wages. So at the end, native employment falls from, in this case, L to N prime. So again, so this is the case where you would expect lower employment for native-born workers. But then the next is then we go on to talk about the complementarities and the substitutability. And in this case, we're relaxing that they're perfect substitutes, and allow for native workers and immigrants to work together, but may bring different skills to the table. And here I'm showing if I teach labor economics. This is the example when they're gross complement. So if you have immigrants who come in and put downward pressure on wages for where the immigrants are in their market, and the two are gross complements, then you'll see the scale effect outweigh the substitution effect, and you'll see increased demand for the native born workers. And so it's typically framed in like a skilled, unskilled type framework if you teach labor economics. But this is if they're gross complements, you do see increased demand here for native born workers when there's increased immigration. And we have a Cobb-Douglas function that then we derive wage equation from. And you can also see this relationship here. So for these native born workers, they will see more will be hired and they'll be at higher wages. And you can see that through the wage equation. So totally different expected outcomes when you change the substitutability here to imperfect substitutes. Okay, then we also have a model that looks at relative skill. And so this one deviates. Now we have two skilled groups, skilled and unskilled, but we're saying that immigrants and natives are perfect substitute within skill groups. But what's different here is that we have these relative demand and relative supply in terms of the relative skills. And if in this case, if immigrants are relatively skilled, then you'd see a rightward shift in the supply, putting downward pressure on this wage premium for the skilled wage to the unskilled wage. And so in this case, this is a different approach to modeling what would happen if you have an increase in supply of immigrants. In this case, it would be skilled workers on unskilled workers. And then the remaining three, my time. Okay, the remaining models in this part of the handbook are all a set of CES production functions and allow for a whole bunch of other complementarities and substitutability between different inputs. So it allows us to look at the interaction between a whole bunch of different types of labor and capital too, which I'll get to in a second. But in this case, we have the degree of substitutability, and this is a CES model here where N is native born workers, M are immigrants, and then the delta is part of the elasticity, where 1/1 minus delta is the elasticity of substitution between immigrants and natives. And again, like big picture, these are models to help with predictions of what happens when there's increased immigration on labor market outcomes of native born workers. And this will give you a wage equation, which you see here at the bottom. And we have a table where we summarize all the different combinations of outcomes in terms of wages based on the substitutability between native workers and immigrant workers, or vice versa, like how easy it is for them to substitute for each other. The higher the elasticity, the more substitutable immigrants are for natives and vice versa. And you can see here we have different scenarios ranging from gross substitutes to perfect substitutes, gross complements, and perfect complements in production. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you, it expands upon to have a model that has skilled and unskilled, and then another model that allows for differences across age-specific and experience-specific labor inputs. So all these different nested type CES models where you can have these cross elasticities of substitution. And then the last model, this is the seventh model of the 7 models, is to relax the assumption that capital is fixed and then put capital into the mix as well as another variable, another input that can change. And in this case, there's more elasticities of substitution. In this case, the way it's modeled here is you have them between physical capital and unskilled. You have it between skilled and unskilled, and then capital and skilled. But there's a lot of other combinations that you can do and that people are working on, and it can be generalized to the labor market. As you see there, can be looking at the impact on natives by education, age, country, and year. So those are the models, the theoretical models, which we feel really helpful to inform the empirical models. I'm an empirical labor immigration economist, and so these, we're touching just briefly here on 4 of the different approaches, but some of the main approaches that people have taken in modeling the impact on native born workers when there is immigration. And the first one is pretty much the earlier version, where people look at spatial models, just look at what happens to outcomes for native born workers in terms of labor or employment for the most part when there's difference or increased or a variation in immigrant shares across some type of area. So, in general, you look at the labor market impact of immigration by comparing native outcomes in areas with a large amount of immigrants to native outcomes in areas with few immigrants, and run a simple OLS regression. But data can be biased if there's selection or endogeneity, if immigrants are attracted to areas with better labor market outcomes. And at the bottom of these slides, it says findings, and just, I'm almost out of time. In the interest of time, I didn't list them all, but they're in our paper if you want to see. But for the most part, as I said, there's very little impact of immigrants on native-born workers. But so at the bottom of these slides, it will say findings. So how were endogeneity or these selection issues addressed? People put in multiple years to maybe a repeated cross-section, and then put in fixed effects for time and the region, trying to pick up and control for their the time invariant, an area-specific fixed effect, and then a time-specific factor. Or you can first difference the data and estimate a beta similar to that. And beta, again, is the parameter of interest. You can also look at the you can construct instrumental variables. Again, often commonly used, people look at past immigration patterns, network. So to look at initial immigration share as an instrumental variable in the past, something going on now. There's a whole bunch of alternatives called shift share and supply push, but the shift share often looks at distribution of immigrants by an origin country in the past, and then redistributes later immigrants based on the initial distribution of immigrants by origin country, or at least that's how I've done it myself. And then other instrumental variables can be weather. So you want something that's correlated with immigration and not with the labor market outcomes of natives, things that have changed in terms of economics, political or other changes. And then in some countries, there's been random assignments of immigrants. So that's been another way especially in terms of refugee resettlement. In other countries, not as much in the United States, where it's considered exogenous. And in that case, that could address the bias. Again, mixed results, some findings of negative impacts on natives' wages. Like big picture, it tends to be, less skilled native wages tend to be the most hurt if there is a negative impact, and that tends to be in the U.S. So I don't want to generalize. Okay, so that's the first set of models. This is the second out of 4 is natural experiments or differences in differences. And I guess you're pretty familiar with them, but you want to find some type of exogenous event or something that's happened in nature, maybe a change in policy or a natural disaster that would change the influx of immigrants, and then look to see what happened after the immigrants arrived. And you want a control group. And again, with parallel trends, you want a control group that would have had the same outcomes if the treatment had occurred. So you need to find a valid control group. If you can't find that, then people have also used synthetic controls to develop a treatment group using various weighting schemes. Again, little impact and little evidence of adverse impacts. And of course, the most famous example is the Mariola boat lift difference in difference or natural experiment. The third of 4 is the skill cells approach. And in this case, you're looking at across skill groups rather than by area. Typically, you look at different age, education, experience groups to see you need variation in immigrants in these cells to see if those that have more immigrants or fewer immigrants have a differential impact on the labor market outcomes of natives. And if so, the key assumption here for the most of the models is that these immigrant flows in the skill affect those in the same skills, affect the natives in that same skill cell. And there's not spillover effects, not cross complementarities and suitability, but people do work in that area. But the advantage, if you look at it at the national level, is that you don't have to worry about diffusion, people moving out, people moving in, or people selecting into certain areas because of better labor market outcomes. That's the positive side. The negative side is that they're very sensitive to the size of the skills and the number of skill cells, and that also, and kind of just related to the talk about education, is that not natives and immigrants in one skill cell may not be substitutable, especially if education isn't recognized and there's brain waste or skill downgrading by immigrants. And then also it's being put in a cell might not be exogenous, like there might be selection into a skill cell itself. Okay, I've got a minute. I'm doing okay. And the last group of models are structural models, and those overlap a lot with the CES models that I just talked about, where you have a production function, often a CES, and then you want to either estimate or use parameters that others have come up with to parameterize a production function, and then see what it would give you in terms of changes in wages, labor market outcomes once you have these parameters. The advantages are that you can then estimate these cross effects, and you can look at changes in capital and these cross elasticity of substitution. But I think that there's only a finite number that you can do. But the disadvantages are that the models are highly sensitive to these parameters. Almost done. And then, okay, the other channels, we also have a section in the chapter where we look at other channels that natives may react in changing their own behavior, changing the skills, changing their occupations, changing where they live. Firms might change what they produce based on the available labor and the immigrant pool and what the immigrants themselves are demanding in terms of product demand. And there are findings that suggest this is going on. And then in terms of area of future research, we put together 5 different bullet points here that maybe more work can be done looking at employer-employee data. Sometimes that's hard to get your hands on. You can look at dynamic effects, seeing if these effects are long run or short run. There's a whole new, a lot of work being done on two-way fixed effects and differential treatments, or the differential timing, staggered timing of treatments and continuous treatments that maybe older, these other topics that have already been discussed could go back and be revisited. Look at social and political institutions, and then also look at different countries rather than the usual pool of countries that people have been looking at. Maybe collect new data on low-income countries and non-Western countries. I think I only went over by a minute or two, and I hope that made sense, but we tried to stay we tried to answer the question the best we could, and stayed pretty structured. So we really value your feedback, and we would love to share what we've done and advertise it. And thank you for giving us the idea of making it a working paper. We will do that.
Very good. So yeah, so this is all on the right track. Now, just for completeness, you go through methods. That's perfectly fine. But of course, you should know, as all, if you look at the table of contents of the project, there is entire sections about methods. Yes. So for instance, there's also a chapter on difference and difference, so to speak, with the state of the art or so. So when you use these methods and talk about, that's fine, but use it in the context of your applications. Of course, I'm just mentioning it so that some kind of replication is important, yes, because we cannot be sure that everything explained everywhere right, yes. Of course, you don't have to explain what an OLS question is, yes. So, but else it's possible to mix it up with your with the work which is done in your section.
Okay, I'll have to go back and reread it, but I think that's what we've tried to do, is to put the literature, drives the I mean, that's why we only have 4 types of methods rather than 10 different methods.
Also, sometimes, I mean, as it is, I mean, in our disciplines, there are fashions going on and which are not relevant in other sub-disciplines, yes, and it might be useful to understand what in a certain subgroup of research is done. So so we are not only looking at models which are really causal or whatever. I mean, we don't throw away all the papers which are not causal in whatever sense, because that would be not much would be left. And the question is whether in 10 years people will still think this is the most relevant question. Yes, I mean, when I was younger, I mean, OLS was bad, and 30 years ago, and we all run complicated regressions. And many years later, we know now that it's better to do OLS. Okay, I mean, I'm joking. And okay, so we are flexible all over, but of course should focus in the sections on the mission. Yes, there is, for instance, a section where we rigorously want only studies who are causal or whatever, something like that, but not in general. Okay, so these were some general remarks. Are there questions which you would like to raise, not only about, I mean, your simple chapters, but on the project?
Just by the way, Cynthia, I don't know, you probably know already, but there are at least 2 papers using matched employer-employee data. One is using Danish matched employer-employee data, and one is Portuguese.
Okay, do you mind sending us? We may have it. I don't think so, though.
Yeah, well, one is a bit of self-promotion. So Portuguese paper is my paper with co-authors, and there's one by I think 3 Danish. I'll send you the. I'll send you both of them.
So matched employer-employee data.
Yeah. So we basically use Portuguese to look at kind of not just the self, sort of each skill level. So we had about 15 skills. And so we want to see how it changes with immigrants and stuff. And so we, across different kind of models, we found natives and immigrants are complements rather than substitutes.
Okay, thank you.
Same thing was done by the Danish paper. They use slightly different model, but pretty much the same.
You guys are on the frontier.
Yes. We had areas for future research, but it's already there. Thank you. And I apologize for not knowing.
Yeah, no worries.